Hello, and welcome to 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the significant and yet very strategic choices that we all can make in order to become the best version of ourselves. My name is Dr. Michael Brown, and I am the host of 3 Words, and I am here in a new space today, socially distanced, of course, from my son. Justin, welcome back to 3 Words. I'm excited to have you here and to engage in a very, I think, significant conversation about 3 words that I think affect us all. Would you share those with us?
I agree, Dad. So thanks for having me on. And today's 3 words are resist the temptation.
You know, one of the misperceptions I think we have when we have this conversation about temptation, and I hear it all the time, is I'll have clients and friends and colleagues say to me, I would have loved to have made a fantastic decision in this particular instance. However, the temptation was way too strong and I could not resist. That's not true. We can resist temptation. Don't you think?
I would definitely agree. I think even the idea of, temptation is this thing outside of me. It's this thing that happened to me at no fault of my own. Oftentimes it seems that we actually choose our way into temptation. So even, we bring ourselves to the temptation and the temptation doesn't happen to us. We choose the temptation and we willingly, because our desires are so strong, we choose our way into that temptation.
And I think in many ways that resisting temptation is difficult for 3 reasons. First of all, perspective, that we're looking only at today. Secondly, pleasure, that we're living only for today and for now. And then finally, pressure. Let's be honest. Particularly during a global pandemic, we are looking for some temporary relief. Perspective, pleasure, pressure. It makes resisting hard, difficult, but there is no sense that temptation has overtaken me. But as well, I've never been to the Grand Canyon. We've taken lots of family vacations over the years, son, but we've never made our way to the Grand Canyon. But I was thinking about this in regards to this conversation about temptation. If I was going to take my family, particularly when you were young children, up to the Grand Canyon,
Sure,
I would not encourage us to see how close we could get to the edge of the Grand Canyon before falling in. I would say, you know what? We want to examine, we want to enjoy, we want to see the Grand Canyon and all of its beauty, but we want to keep a little bit of a safe distance from the Grand Canyon edge. And yet so often we tend to say, well, I went all the way up to the edge and I can't believe I found myself in this space right now. And I just fell into temptation, but we chose our way. There's little steps, right? Small steps up to the point where we just feel like we can't resist that temptation. And obviously temptation is spanning across several dimensions of our lives.
I definitely agree. I think the challenge with temptation is that oftentimes our immediate desires don't align with our long-term goals. And you and I have talked a lot about this idea of focus on becoming and thinking about who do I want to be at the end of my life and what do I want to be like and what do I want to be said of me. I think in the context of temptation, oftentimes we can really focus on the behavior. I don't want to do this thing. I'm really going to focus on that thing that I shouldn't do or the thing that I'm trying not to do. But instead, it can be more helpful for us to focus on who do we want to be that is the opposite of the temptation.
Well, and we talk a lot about dream, decide, do. In fact, that was a podcast that we did. This notion that without the dream of who we really want to become, decisions become challenging. They become hard because there's no connection between the decision I'm making in the moment and the dream of the future.
I agree. Yeah. And I think a practice that has been really helpful for me in the context of resisting temptation, I think first to name the temptation, to not just think, oh, this is something I want or this is a good thing, but to specifically think to myself, this is a temptation I'm having. Secondly, that I would identify what is that long-term goal that this immediate desire is in opposition of. Next, that I would delay immediate gratification, that I would say, I'm going to choose not to have the thing I want right now for the thing that I really most want in the future. And then finally, that I would replace the unhealthy or the desire that is going to hurt me with a healthy choice. So let me give an example. I think one of my big temptations in this season is my wife works night shift and I'm home alone and I'm bored and I'm working. And I often find myself wanting to have a second dinner when I'm not hungry, but it feels pleasurable. It feels like it helps to release that sense of boredom and maybe loneliness. And I will find myself thinking, I just want to go grab a second dinner. And sometimes I'll say, this is a temptation. This is not helping me to achieve my physical and my fitness goals. I will say no to the dinner for right now. And actually, I'm going to get on the ground and do 10 push-ups.
Wow.
To replace that temptation to have a second dinner for no reason at all. And instead to make a healthy choice instead.
You know, I love that, son, because that notion of if we just keep telling ourselves, don't, it's going to become exhausting.
Right.
So we need to say, don't. But in place of that, now I'm going to do.
Right.
And I'm going to do this in place of the don't. You know, it's interesting as we talk about temptation, even that word, I'm not sure what it triggers in your mind, but probably for a lot of our listeners and viewers right now, it triggers this notion of spiritual temptation or moral temptation or somehow connected to religious ideology. And yet, as we talk about the 12 dimensions of a human being's life, there are temptations that we all face across a variety of those dimensions. Obviously, the example you just shared was that of the physical dimension. There's temptations regularly to make different choices or not the best choices in regard to food or maybe in regards to fitness. I'm not going to go to the gym today. I'm not going to work out. I'm not going to go to bed at a decent hour.
Right.
And then tomorrow choose to be tired. I want to enjoy this moment, even though it's 1 a.m. and I'm getting up in 5 hours, instead of thinking, how will I feel tomorrow and who will I be and how will I interact with those around me? So I'm just curious if there are other connections you see to the variety of dimensions that we talk about.
Yeah, I definitely think in the professional dimension of life that one of the big things that trips me up is wasting time on social media. I think that can be a big temptation. And even times where I'm doing work or I'm studying or even I'm at the hospital in the clinical setting and I find myself suddenly on Instagram. That's like, how did I even get here kind of thing. And I think that, you know, being on social media as much as I find myself in causes me to believe that I'm more connected to people than I actually am. And it in the relational dimension, in a sense too, not only does it make me less productive in my work, but it distances me from the people around me. Additionally, I find myself in this season as I'm wrapping up medical school and thinking about the next chapter. I have a really hard time being present in the moment because I'm tempted to be preoccupied with the future and to be thinking about what's coming next. And I think that is a temptation as well, that in, you know, the relational dimension that I mentioned and then the professional dimension can be a pretty tough one for me as well.
Well, and I think too, in regards to the recreational dimension, we think a lot about entertainment. And obviously you mentioned social media, but then obviously there's gaming, there's shopping. You know, I've even encouraged my children as they continue to age, as you know, that thing that you really want to purchase, that you feel like I've got to have it. Why not wait maybe even 3 days and see if you still want it as badly? And obviously gaming, you know, Jameson, my 12-year-old, he loves his Fortnite. And to resist the temptation to play it for a 5th or 6th hour instead to go outside and to do something more active. There's all these various temptations that make their way into our lives and into our experience. But I think it's important to say temptation is not bad. It is what it is. There are always going to be different desires and influences that pull us different directions. The goal is not to say, well, that's bad and I shouldn't even think about that. The goal is to see the temptation, just like you said, to actually acknowledge it, to identify it, to investigate it, to actually explore it. Why does this particular temptation, let's go deeper, right, have this hold on me? Why does it seem to keep reoccurring and have this certain draw in my life? Because I think for all of us, there's going to be different temptations. They're going to have more power in our lives than others. And probably even saying in our lives isn't the best phrase because I said temptation is not within you. It's outside of you. So temptation can't overtake you. It's something that you have to invite in.
I see.
And that you actually have to respond to with a choice.
Definitely. I think one of the things when I think about this conversation of temptation is that for me, I believe it's never too late to resist the temptation. And while we can definitely make choices that make it harder and harder as we get closer to that edge of the Grand Canyon that you talked about, it can make it harder and harder for us to resist temptation. But that I think a challenge that I struggle with is sometimes when I'm in the process of giving into a temptation in my life, I can sometimes think to myself, well, I've already given in. It's too late for me to stop now, or what's the point? I'm already in this. I might as well just get it over with. But I think to use the example of a second dinner, for example, there are times where I will pour myself a bowl of cereal and I'll have the milk out on the counter and I'll be about to pour the milk. And I think to myself, if I could stop now, but I'm already here. But truly, I could actually pour the cereal back into the box. And even in that, as I'm giving into the temptation, I could stop it right there. Or even if I've poured the milk, I could say, you know what? I'm not hungry, and I could still choose to dump the cereal. It might feel wasteful, but at least it's not causing me to not become the best version of myself.
It's funny. I'm sure some of our listeners, as they know you and maybe even see you if they're watching it on your YouTube channel, are thinking, Justin Brown, this is the last thing he needs to be worrying about is, does he have some cereal in the evening? But I think what it shows us, and it demonstrates even in your own life, and it's the bigger principle, is not whether or not I have a bowl of cereal at 10 o'clock at night.
Right.
The question is, how intentional am I with my choices? And do I always just stumble into, unconsciously or even consciously, these short-term temporary decisions without really giving thought? And I love how you regularly, and we talk about this, of course, even in life beyond a podcast, you regularly pause and ask yourself, why? Why am I doing this? And is this really who I want to be? And is this contributing to who I am becoming, and so forth? And I just think that is absolutely fantastic. It's a great discussion, my son. And I think, I want to have a follow-up podcast with you. At some point, I want to talk about how temptation, at times when it leads to those unhealthy choices, and then those unhealthy choices, as they're repeated, begin to snowball into what we would call an addiction. And I know even you have done a fair amount of study in medical school, and you can talk about the science, I can talk about the philosophy, and together maybe, what are the 3 words? Reverse your addiction, right? Or something of that nature.
Sure.
But I would love to have that conversation with you. But even for today, I think the baby step would be to really acknowledge that there are things around us that are tempting. And temptation is not bad. And it's not the end of the world if we give into temptation. But I think it's worth resisting. It's worth looking at temptation in the eye, maybe even calling someone or texting someone and inviting someone into that conversation in the moment and saying, you know what? In this instance, I'm going to say no. Because as you talked about at the beginning of the podcast, what is most important is not my behavior in the moment, but who I am becoming. So whatever that temptation is in your life, whichever dimension you find yourself struggling to be consumed with the immediate in the temporary, I guess I would say, just to summarize again, it's worth it. It's worth it to resist the temptation. For life coaching, consulting services, or to hire a keynote speaker, please visit dmbcoaching.com.